The moment of silence. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. Does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics achieve sobriety. Hi, my name's Dave and I'm an alcoholic. And
Hi, Dave.
Can we go around the room and introduce ourselves?
My name is John, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, John. My name is Amy, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Amy.
My name is Candy, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi,
Candy.
And my name is Patty, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Patty. Okay, and our speaker today is going to be John.
Thanks a lot, Dave. My name is John. I'm an alcoholic, a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I'll share my experience, strength, and hope with you, and I'm going to dedicate this tape to my friend Dave. You know, I'll tell you a little about myself. You know, I was born in the brick bottom section of Somerville. You know, it was a tough neighborhood. You know, Jesus, you know, I had a wonderful mother. You know, I had 4 little brothers, and I had a little sister. And my mother used to say to us, you know, your father's a good man when he ain't drinking. You know, my father was a rugged, powerful drinker. Jesus, he was really trouble. And, you know, he'd come home, you know, in one of his binges, you know, and I would take my 4 little brothers and my sister. We lived in a 2-family house, and we lived on the upper floor, and we had an attic. And you know, I used to round them up. I was the oldest, and take them upstairs till it quieted down. And you know, it used to take like about 4 or 5 cops, you know, to get my father out of the house. You know, he always went the hard way. Jesus, they'd beat the shit out of him, you know. And my mother used to jump in, you know, and say, you're hurting him. And that I couldn't figure out, you know. And but my mother didn't last very long, you know. She died in a very early age, you know, early 30s, you know. And you know, we were just like steps, you know. We were born one right after the other, you know. And but when my mother died, I knew that my father loved my mother, you know. Jesus, I never see a big, strong man like him cry so much, you know. He really went to pieces. Then I knew that he loved my mother, and today I knew he was an alcoholic. And he did the best he could. Jesus, he calmed down, you know, and he kind of took care of us as best he could, you know. There was a whole gang of us, and you know, he used to take us to the cemetery, you know, and put flowers on a grave, and he'd cry. He was a powerful, big man. And he remarried, and I had a stepmother, you know. And my life our life began to get pretty good. And but that didn't last long either. You know, my father came home from work one day, and he had a headache, and it got worse. And my stepmother called a doctor, and the doctor came and said he was having a cerebral hemorrhage, and that he wouldn't live through the night. And she dropped dead right then, and he died during the night. And you know, we didn't have anything. You know, we were very poor. We lived in a poor neighborhood. And my brothers, I had a sister and a brother that went to California, and the rest of them were screwing about. And I, being the oldest, I wound up on the street. And I'll tell you, geez, I didn't have much where I was living, but I didn't have anything now, and my house was locked up, and I remember them dying, but I don't remember where they're buried, and I don't know where they're buried today. And I know where my mother's buried, but I don't know where my father and stepmother's buried. And so I wound up on the street at 14 years old, and I drifted to the center of Somerville. I came from Somerville, and the first night that I slept, there was a big highway department, the Somerville Highway Department there, and in them days when I was a youngster, they had these big paper wagons, you know, and they used to collect papers, and they would separate the ashes from the papers, you know, and the paper wagons. And Jesus, I went into one of them and I fell asleep, you know. I cried myself to sleep. Jesus, I didn't know what to do. I was completely lost. So anyway, I get up, and I can remember just like it was yesterday, and I get up and I drifted toward the square, and I went into a restaurant, and I said to the guy in there, I'm hungry. I'd like to eat, you know. And I told him, you know, and Jesus, he fed me and let me sleep in the restaurant that night. And the next day, he got me a job in a hardware store in the same square. And they had a big warehouse. And they put me in a warehouse. And I used to load trucks with nails and roofing paper and stuff like that. And I lived there. I made my home in the warehouse, you know. And I used to see little kids, you know, outside riding their bicycles, and I knew they had to be something different than the kind of a life I was leading, you know. But I didn't do any of them things. I just worked there. I wasn't eating right, you know, and I wasn't living right. I lasted there for 2 years, and I got sick, you know. I got real sick, and they put me in a Somerville hospital. And they got me well, you know, and they got me a job, and they got me a room, you know, because I didn't have anything, so they were very good to me. And I don't know, on this job that they got me, it was a very light job. I wasn't a very strong kid. Then I weighed about 120 pounds or so, and they made envelopes and soap wrappers and stuff, and it was mostly girls worked there. And there was this one girl that used to share a lunch with me, you know, and I didn't know what she was after. I didn't know anything about girls or anything about anything, really. I never got even educated. I never went to school that much, you know. So anyway, she was very, very, very kind and nice, you know, and she'd share a lunch with me, and we became very close, you know. She invited me down to her home. She'd come from Lynn one Sunday, and for Sunday dinner, you know, and her folks come down and pick me up. I rode down on the train, and Jesus, I had the most wonderful dinner that I ever had in my life. I saw more food up to that point in my life than I ever saw. It was only a Sunday dinner, you know, and I really enjoyed myself. And then she introduced me, like her mother took me one side, and you know, wanted to know my background and all that. And when she got through with me, she told me to scram. You know, I wasn't like good enough for a daughter, you know. So, Jesus, I was hurt. You know, I felt awful. Anyway, they wanted to ride me back down the station. I said no, I'll walk. And you know, it was about a mile, and as I was walking down to get the train to go home, you know, I thought about it. I said, Jesus, you know, what a life. You know, I lost my mother, I lost my stepmother, I lost my father, I lost my family. Something good came into my life, and I lost that, you know. And so I quit that job. I just couldn't face that girl. So I went out and I got a job. I'm 17 years old now, and I got a job as an iron worker in construction. You know, I was working in Lawrence, and we all went out to lunch one day, and we went into this place, you know, and I didn't see anything to eat, you know, and it was a bar. So they all ordered drinks, and I ordered what they wanted. You know, I never drank up until that point in my life. I never tasted booze. And I drank what they drank. It was a shot and a beer. And I'm going to tell you, that straightened me right out. You know, I felt so good that I didn't care what happened. You know, it just made me feel good. You know, made me feel like I was part of something. And I went back to work, you know, and that was always in my mind, you know, about getting another drink, you know. And I didn't do it all the time, but I was always thinking about it. I wanted to get that freedom feeling, you know. And Jesus, you know, I was making more money than I ever made up to that point as an iron worker in construction. And I bought a little car, you know. And I was doing fine. And this little girl looked me up, you know. She tracked me down. And I said, Jesus, you know, you'll be in trouble. You know, your mom don't like me. And as a matter of fact, where I was living. The guy I called my father didn't like her, you know, because she rejected me. So she said, let's get married, you know. I knew nothing about any of that, you know. I says, all right, we'll get married. How do you do that? And we get into my car and we went up to Hampshire. You know, she directed the whole scenario, you know. Up to that point, I didn't know nothing. And we got married by a justice of the peace in Windham, New Hampshire. Jesus, it's just like yesterday, and you know, it's 65 years ago. It just went by that we get married 65 years ago. Anyway, we came back home, and I thought, really and honestly, as true as I sit here, I thought she was supposed to go home, you know. And I said, no, she says, I'm supposed to live with you. Now I'm 17, 18 years old right in there, and I didn't know nothing, really. And anyway, she stayed with me, but Jesus, you know, she wanted to move to Lynn, so she didn't like that room that I had, so we moved to Lynn, you know, and Jesus, I'll tell you, two of the biggest mistakes I ever made in my life was, you know, getting married and moving to Lynn, you know, Jesus. Lynn, the city of sin, oh God, I'll tell you. We were going along pretty good. I had an apartment there, and, you know, a big depression came along in the early, I have to put this on record, Dave, that I'm 84 years old, so as I go along, you know, as I go through the years, you know, they'll know that Christ, that I ain't gone nuts. And anyway, the big depression came, you know, and I got a job in Sears and Roebuck in Lynn, just changing tires, you know. It was just making a few bucks. And there was a little store next to Sears and Roebuck, and a guy owned a bicycle shop, and he sold radios. And Jesus, did this guy drink? This guy, his name was Vassar Stackpole, and he would play a very important part in my life later on. I drank with this guy. This guy would drink anything. He had a business, but it wasn't a very good one, you know. And I used to swipe tires out of Sears and Roebuck, and little bicycle tires, and bring them over, and he'd sell them, and he'd go across the street. I'll get some booze, he'd say, and he got bay rum, you know, and he'd put it in a whiskey bottle, see. And Jesus, I'll say, this tastes funny, you know. He'd say, that's good stuff, John, drink it. Well, anyway, life went on, you know. World War II came along, you know, and I kind of drifted away, you know. My business got good, and I began to go away, and I got a big job in the Springfield Arsenal in Springfield, Mass. And this is where my drinking started to pick up. You know, I was away from home. I had money enough. I was drinking every day, you know, and I was coming home on weekends, and I'd come home drinking. And my wife she was just one of them ladies that hated booze, you know. She couldn't tolerate any kind of booze. And I'd try to come home without drinking, but it never worked. So she began to put restraints on me, you know, like ultimatums and then restraints. And she says, we got 4 little children, she said, and you're not going to be coming home drinking, you know. So anyway, you know, you get into that breaking the doors down and all that stuff. And finally, she saw an ad in the Lynn paper that said, you know, if you drink and you want to, it's your business, and if you're drinking, can't stop, it's our business. That was in a Lynn paper. And she called that number, and up my house came this guy that I used to drink with, you know, that owned that little store. He was sober. He started a group in Lynn. He had another guy with him that never worked a day in his life, and he had a suit on, you know, this guy did, and they both looked good. And they began to tell me that I had an illness, you know. I couldn't buy that, you know, that I was sick, you know. And they were telling me, you know, about their own drinking and how sick and all that stuff. And they invited me to, they started a group in Lynn in 10 City Hall Square. And he started that in 1944. Now, things were getting tough, really tough with me, you know, and my wife was giving me ultimatum after ultimatum. As a matter of fact, I got arrested about 25 or 30 times trying to just get in my own house. Well, I couldn't accept the fact that I was an alcoholic. You know, we drank on a job, I worked every day, you know, and I did all them things. But so anyway, you know, things were getting real rough, and I didn't think, AA was very young then, and I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think much of that, but we used to take pledges in them days, you know. You go to a priest, you know, and you kneel down with him and just say a few prayers, and, you know, you won't drink again and all that stuff. And then I said, well, you know, I was kept drinking and that didn't work too good, and so I went to my first AA meeting anyway, and Jesus, I walked into that meeting down there and I was awe-stricken, you know. I saw guys in there that had great big red noses, you know. They were old, they had bald heads, and you know, they were from Bridgewater and they were from Danvers State Hospital, you know, and there was no women. And I went home and I said to my wife, I said, Jesus, you don't expect me to go down there. They're alcoholics. I said, they need that, you know. I says, I'm not like them. You know, and I went on, I banged back and forth, you know. Well, anyway, things were getting so rough that in 1946, you know, I took another pledge, and I went to AA, and, you know, I got sober, you know, and Jesus, it was wonderful, you know. It wasn't hard, and I still didn't believe I was an alcoholic, but my life was getting better. So, anyway, it got real good. You know, I had 4 little girls. A boy came along about 1949, a couple of years after I got sober, and I had 4 little girls and a boy and a good job. I was a foreman by now, but I still had to go away to make a living. You know, it was the only way I could make a living, and I made a good living. I bought a big house, and my wife had a car, I had a car, and we were getting along fine. You know, the time went on, and I was doing a big job in Winooski, Vermont, you know, and it was in July, and I used to fly home from there. I had a big job there. I used to fly on a little shuttle plane there, Northeast Airlines at that time, and it'd take about an hour. And my wife would meet me at the airport, and it was in July. And I called my wife up and I said, I think I'll stay up for the weekend. It's hot. I'm going to go over across Lake Champlain, and I'm going across to Port Kent, and I'm going to lay on the beach, you know. She said, fine, take it easy, you know. On the way to get the ferry, I parked my car. On the way to get the ferry, I heard this music behind a stockade fence, and I opened the gate, and the American Legion was having a big bash. Jesus, they were bending their elbow and they were drinking beer. And a thought crossed my mind, you know, that I could drink a bottle of beer, you know. And I did that, and you know, that took me, I just didn't stop there, you know. I went into a blackout, you know. I switched over. I was never a beer drinker. You know, I was little. I couldn't stand a lot of beer, you know. And anyway, I kept going, you know, and I got arrested that night, and I didn't know what the hell for. And anyway, I lost my job, I lost my wife, I lost the kids, I sold my car, you know, and I got put out of Burlington, you know. That's where I was drinking, and I wound up in the south end of Boston. You know, AA became like a memory, you know. It became just like a memory. It just went right out of my head. You know, and I wound up there in a little place they call Blackstone Park, and it was full of winos just like me. I had now, you know, after being there a while, shifted over to wine. I learned that I couldn't drink anything else. I took a drink of wine, and that would stay down, you know, and I had a route. Blackstone Park was on Washington Street. I'd walk along Washington Street and steal the nickels and dimes off the newspapers in them days, you know, and get enough to buy a pint of wine and go back to the park and drink again, you know. And geez, it was awful. I used to sit in that park on that bench, and I'd cry my eyes out, you know. I knew I had a wife, you know, and I knew I had kids, you know, and she was busting a hump, you know, taking care of these kids, you know. And here I am up there, you know. I tried to stop drinking, you know, and I just couldn't stop. I didn't have the power to choose to stop. Every time I tried to stop, I'd go into a seizure, you know, and they'd take me over to the the old Washingtonian, Jamaica Plain. And I was convinced in my mind from that happening to me that I couldn't live unless I drank. And I was convinced of that. And I was always trying to make up my mind to try to go to work, and, to help my wife. And I just couldn't do it. I made one attempt, and I told this many a times when I speak, I went down to Union Hall, and I says, Jesus, if I could only make a few bucks so I could send her something. I went down Maine, and with 4 Indians. I worked with Indians in them days, there was a lot of them. They're supposed to be courageous guys to go up in the air. They're fucking stupid. Oh, excuse me. I hope that ain't on the tape. They're stupid, but, they're like me. If they fall, they don't know the difference. They land on their head anyway. I worked with them guys, and we went up there with an awful lot of booze, and we ran out, and there was an engineer that ran the plant, a power plant. We were building a building up there to cut logs, and he said, if we fire up a train, there was a locomotive out there that he would drive it, and we'd go get some booze, and, we stole the train, and we got that thing going. It was a logging train. A locomotive belonged to the company, and we drove it 10 or 15 miles, and we got a shitload of booze. Here I am. We got a whole lot of booze, and on the way back, the Indians wanted to drive the train, and they did. They took over the controls, and they goosed that thing, and it was a narrow gauge railroad, and we tipped it over and and wrecked it, and we didn't get hurt, but it was a very serious offense, and we went to prison. We went to prison in Thomaston, Maine, and we did time, and I don't remember how long, but coming out of there, I didn't have any place to go. So I went on a Indian reservation with them Indians in Old Town, Maine, the Penobscot Reservation, and it was an island, Indian island, and you got across there. One Indian rowed a boat, a long boat. It'd take about 4 or 5 across. There's a bridge now that goes over there. Walter Dyer tells me. I've never been there since. And he'd row you back and forth. Anyway, I was on the island, I don't know how long, and I got in trouble there. My middle name was Trouble, I got in trouble with an Indian squaw, and the husband didn't have any sense of humor, and Jesus, him and another Indian come at me with a hatchet, and, hey, they tried to chop my dingling off, and that's on the tape, and good luck. And, and I broke my leg, and Jesus, I wound up in a hospital there, and, I got put out of Old Town, Maine, and I had a cast on this leg, this one here, and a crutch, and they told me I had to leave. And I got to Orono, Maine, that's where the University of Maine is, and I didn't last there, and I got to Bangor. And, getting back to the south end of Boston from there is, it's like a story in itself. You stop in a church, you beg for a meal, you get a script, you go in a YMCA, and you get all that stuff, and you drink in between, whatever money you had. And I wound up back in the south end again. Same old stuff, same old route. I was sleeping in a car with a guy one night. It was near the big cathedral there, what they call Union Park Square, and there was a lot there, and there was a car there. And this guy and I were sleeping in the car, and the damn thing was shaking, And I said to him, there's an earthquake, and he said, no, we don't have earthquakes, and the car was shaking. Well, a wrecker hooked onto it, and was towing it away. And he discovered us when we got to Alston, and he threw us out. And now we're stuck in Alston, and Jesus, I'll tell you, it's tough getting back, Jesus, nobody wants to look at you when you're a drunk, you're dirty, Anyway, I get back to the south end again, the same old story, I tried one more time to go to work, and I went down to New York, and I never should have done that. I was too sick. And I went down there, and I didn't last even one day. And I went up to the Salvation Army, and I was going to commit suicide, I really was. I went in there and I saw the captain sitting at the desk, and I told him, I said, Jesus, I'm just going to commit suicide, and I want you to write my wife a letter so that she'll know that I'm dead, you know. And he said he would, and he said he'd go in the back room and he'll get a piece of paper and an envelope, and he went there and he called the cops, you know. And the cops came and they put me in a nut house, you know. And, you know, Jesus, I fought as strong. As weak as I was, you know, I didn't want to go to a nut house, but I went. But when I got there, they must have shot me with something. I never did drugs in my life, you know, and they must have hit me with something, because I became very calm, you know, and very peaceful, and I liked it, and I was eating, and I was sleeping, and I had a roof over my head. And I'm going to tell you, they were nuts. This wasn't an alcoholic water. It was a nut water. And we'd be holding hands, and we'd be going around. You know, they were really crazy. But I didn't give a damn, you know. And I was just happy right in that nut house. And time came for me to leave. And, geez, I didn't want to leave, but I had to. I didn't have any place to go. So I had to leave, and I met a young guy. Jesus, I'll tell you, this guy was a con man, first class, you know. He was half my age. I'm now in my 50s, you know. So anyway, we got out of there, and he said to me, he says, I know where we can go, John. He says, there's a place in Greenville, you know, yeah, they call it the Holy Mountains. It's the Christophers, you know, home for homeless men. And we went there, and it was fine. We got cleaned up, they dressed us up, and it was beautiful, but you can't drink there, see. And this guy got a brilliant idea, you know, if we steal the collar, you know, and the uniform and the hat, you know, and we go downtown, and we did. And we passed the hat, and I'm going to tell you, we were doing fine. And we were doing excellent. We were collecting money like you never saw. Somebody put a few pennies in his hat. He called him a cheap bastard, and, you know, that was the end of the street. Jeez, the cops came, put us up. Oh, gee, trouble. Anyway, this guy lived in Glen Falls. I can remember just as plain. He wanted to go back home, and I said, gee, I live in Lynn, you know. I'd love to get back to Lynn, you know. Jesus, I feel like I'm going to croak, you know, and I'm not going to last. I like to be in Lynn. And Jesus, you know, he got me a ticket. He did a job, you know. Well, what he did was not important, but he got me a nice ticket, you know, a nice ride to Lynn. And when I got to Lynn, I didn't have any place to go. You know, I was restrained from going to my house, and I had a brother-in-law that was taking care of an apartment block, and he let me sleep in the cellar. He put a spring down right next to the boiler. This guy didn't like me, but he didn't want me to freeze to death. You know, it was getting cold. And I was laying there one night on that spring, and I was looking up, and it had a little bulb, you know, with a pull string on it. And that bulb began to get huge, you know. And I thought it was going to go like a bomb, you know. And I got up, and Jesus, I breezed out of there and breezed downtown, and I said, God, I got to get a jug of wine, and I'm going to just chug it like that and go off the side road, you know, and it'll kill me, you know. But I did get the jug, and I went off on the side road, and I did drink it, you know, but I woke up in the morning, you know, I didn't die. And again, I heard music, and I said, I'm going nuts, you know. I'm laying right in the grass. And I followed the music, and it was coming out of a little church, and they were all black people. And these little kids were running around with palms, you know. I said, it's got to be Palm Sunday, you know. And, you know, the first time in 9 years, I was up there 9 years, that I kneeled down, you know, and I asked for help, you know. I really kneeled down. I said, Jesus, let me live or let me die, one of the two, you know. And I got up out of there, and I walked out of that church and stood on the sidewalk, and, you know, that was Palm Sunday in 1966, and I never drank again. Never drank again. The grace of God had entered my life. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I was standing on the sidewalk, and I was wondering where I was going to get a drink. And I wasn't allowed in a barroom in Lynn because I would steal your drink. I'd steal your drink, and you could knock the hell out of me, and I didn't care. you know. My teeth were gone, my glasses were gone, everything was gone. And I didn't care, so I wasn't allowed in. I had a mother-in-law that was in the 90s, way up in the 90s, and she was in a nursing home. And I said, if I go up there, she's blind, she can't see, maybe she'll give me a few bucks, maybe she'll open a pocketbook, maybe I'll ransack the thing, you know, with all them things in my mind. And I went up there to see her, and she knew me, and she said she'd give me $10 if I go to an AA meeting. I said, where's the AA meeting? She said, right next to this nursing home. She heard about it. It was Mount Pleasant Detox. They were just opening up Mount Pleasant Detox in 1966, and she knew it. So I said, give me the $10, and I did. I kept my end of the bargain, and I went up there, and I walked into a meeting, and there was a guy hanging the banners. It's still Palm Sunday. He's hanging the banners, and he saw me, and he came over, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and he says, are you having trouble with alcohol? Jesus Christ, I thought that was an understatement. You know? I didn't have any shoes on. My teeth were gone. My glasses were gone. My feet were swollen. My head was full of sores from drinking wine. And this guy took me home. Took me into his house. I couldn't believe it. He cleaned me up. He got me medical attention. He wanted to put me in Mount Pleasant Detox. I didn't think I could stop drinking. I was convinced that if they put me in a room somewhere and closed the door, that I would die. So I refused to go in. But he did get me to medical attention. There was a doctor up there. I'll never forget his name. His name was Dr. O'Brien. And he was very good to me. He was an alcoholic doctor. I think he gave me medication. I'm sure he did. And I lived with this guy. And I began to get well, you know. I had a leg that was falling off. He sent me up to Boston. If I'd have kept out there, I'd have lost this leg. He sent me up to Boston. He gave me treatment with this leg. It's not very good today either, but it's all right. And this guy did everything for me. I went to meetings with him for months and months and months, you know. I'd go with him on commitments. He belonged to the Green Street group. He's dead now. And I went everywhere with him, you know. And he'd sit me right beside him. You know, I was like a dummy, you know. And I'd sit there, and then we'd go to another meeting, and I'd sit there, and I did that for months and months and months. And I began to get well, you know. I began to get back into reality. I don't know why I'm living today, really. You know, I look back in my life, and it scares me, you know. Now I begin to see my kids, you know, and Jesus, I'm gone a long time. And I begin to see my kids, you know, and I begin to hurt. I wanted to hug them, you know. Jesus, I wanted so bad to, you know, put my arms around them. I couldn't do it, you know. I was restrained, you know. I thought I'd die, you know, and I said to this guy, Al, he says, it's no use. I said, you know, my kids are gone, I can't work, I got a bad leg, my health is gone. I says, I just can't keep up. And this guy gave me courage, you know. I went to a meeting one time, and I says, Al, my stomach, I can't get rid of that ball. I see my kids, you know, I see my wife from a distance, you know. I just can't do it. He says, why don't you make like the fourth and fifth step, you know. Try speaking of, you know, letting out. I went to a meeting in Lynn, on the Lynn Common group, right by the Lynn Common, you know. And I said, I got to find somebody to talk to, you know. And I walked out of that meeting, and I saw a drunk. I mean, this guy was gonzo. I knew him, you know. And I went across the street, and I bought a fifth of wine, and I went over, and he was sitting on a bench, and I said, look, sit down. I'm going to give you this jug. You can drink it, but you're going to listen to me. The minute you walk away, I'm going to take the jug. And, you know, I did the fifth step with a drunk, you know. He drank the booze. And I got that all out of me, right? It says another human being. And I never did it again. I did it then. And I never found it necessary to do the fifth step again. I unloaded stuff that I never... To this guy, and he was sitting there like, you know, yeah. And when I got through, you know, he finished that quart, and I just laid him over on the bench, and I walked off. And, you know, I felt better. You know, I felt good. And I kept going to meetings with this guy, and, you know, after 8 years, you know. Oh, Jesus, terrible suffering. You know, and like he made an appointment with my wife, you know, and I got back home, you know. Jesus, I was happy, you know. I had I had a lot of trouble with the kids, but the wife took me back, and two of my daughters were pretty good. The youngest one was, Jesus, you're gonna take that goddamn bum home, you know. And you know, my whole sobriety, right along from the time I Palm Sunday right up till about 10 years was suffering. I mean, hurting. I didn't want to go back to where I was. You know, I didn't want to pick up a drink and go backwards. I just couldn't take that anymore. You know, I didn't want to be in the South End, in the Pine Street Inn, waiting for the van to come up in the wintertime to take you to Bridgewater for voluntary commitments, you know, and trying to keep warm, you know, and looking at them goddamn graves. They have headstones down there with no names on them, drunks, you know, no names on them. You cut that. I didn't want no more of that. So anyway, I hung in there, you know, and I got back home, and I found one of my daughters that she was into blues, you know. Oh God, I said no, you know, I couldn't hack that. You know, she was in it. I put her away, you know. I put her in a place in Carlisle. It was supposed to be a nice place, and then I put her in other places, you know, and she just couldn't stop drinking, you know. And she hadn't drank that long, you know. She was married by now, you know. I was out of my house for 17 years. You know, she was married by now. And I was sitting with her one night, you know, on her bed, you know, and she put her arms around me, you know, and she said, Daddy, why can't I stop drinking? And she took an alcoholic compulsion, you know, and she died right in my arms, you know. Jesus, it was awful, you know. I didn't know whether I was going to, I didn't know what to do, really. And she had a little boy, and my wife took her little boy home, you know, and raised him up. And, you know, we got over that, the hurt of that, you know, and you never get over it, but it's still there. And the boy that came along now, he went to Vietnam, and he came back with everything, drugs and booze, but he seemed to survive. You know, he went to college under the GI Bill, took business administration, you know, and he was drinking, but he was ducking me. He was married, too. And he would avoid me, and I know he was drinking, but I didn't think he was, you know, how bad he was. You know, and he graduated from college businessman and got a good job in the retail business, you know. He even got me a little job, you know, as a security guard. I never worked again, you know. When I get back in the front, I couldn't. I wasn't able. And I could see then his drinking. And he got fired. Anyway, he lost his job. He got a job with Bradley's, and he lost that. He got a job with, he opened up that new store, Paperama, at the Liberty Tree Mall, and he lost that. And finally he wound up, you know, his wife divorced him. He wound up on the street. Well, I wouldn't leave him on the street. So I took him home with me, you know, and I began to put him in institutions, you know, and VA hospitals. And I put him in the Danvers detox 100 times a day, you know, 100 times. The VA hospitals, and I put him in a link house. He was just one of them. He couldn't hear either, you know, and I said, Jesus, you know, I struggle like hell with him. I says, Christ, I can't lose another one, you know. And I put him in a VA hospital in Brockton, you know, and it was around Thanksgiving time here a few years ago, not too long ago. And I was going to take him home for Thanksgiving, you know, and I went down there a few days ahead, you know, and took him out and got his hair cut and all that stuff. But I could see he was way down, you know. Anyway, I went to visit him one day, and I come home that night, and he committed suicide, you know. He just couldn't see, and he went up on Route 24, you know, and jumped in front of a tractor trailer, you know. Jesus, he was squashed, you know. And I had to get down and identify the body, you know, and I thought I was going to have a heart attack. And all this time, you know, I didn't think of a drink, you know. Drink never entered my mind. I dreamt of blowing my brains out, you know. My wife just went right out of her mind. 2 children gone now. She went right out of her mind, you know. And, Christ, I didn't sleep, you know, and taking care of her, and I took her to a psychiatrist, and, you know, she went there for a whole year. And she got hurt, you know, and so she was going to make a trip up there, and I said, geez, I'll go with you. She was on crutches. There was a lady psychiatrist, and we went around. I said, can I go in with her? And she said, fine. And the psychiatrist said to her, you know, you've been coming here for a year, Alice, and I can't seem to get to your problem, you know. And she said, it's him. She pointed it to me, you know. And she let out, he never was home for Christmas. He never saw these kids graduate from high school, you know. He never did this, and you know, and I worked my ass off, and everything she said was true, you know. Everything she said was the truth. She wasn't, and you know, when she got through, you know, she felt better, you know. She had tears in her eyes. She came over and gave me a big hug, you know, and we went home, you know. And on the way out, there's a little more to it than that. I don't want to say that on the tape. You know.
Oh, they had to say it.
And on the way out, you know, the psychiatrist says to me, I'd like to delve into your childhood, you know. And I says, Jesus, boy, that'd be something. I says, for $40 an hour, I'll give you a story that'll blow your pantyhose off. She got a kick out of that. She says, no soap, you know. But you know, my life is good today, you know. Jesus, I went through a lot. I'll tell you, Jesus. My sobriety didn't come easy, you know. But I've got to a point now, you know, where, you know, I got a wife, you know, that's fantastic, you know. I love her and she loves me, and I got 3 daughters today that are beautiful, and they love me, and, you know, and I love them. And I got grandchildren that never saw me drink. I got a grandson and his wife that are in the program that never saw me drink. They asked me to speak at their anniversary, and Jesus, I was stuck. I didn't know. I didn't want them to know all this stuff, you know. So I did. I hit the high spots, and I'm so tickled at that for them. And you know, I got a huge family and everything is fine, you know. Being broke is nothing to me. I don't give a shit, you know. I got a little peace of mind after all them years. I'm sober 27 years, and I'll tell you, about 15 or 16 of them years was real rough, you know. I didn't get to speak for a lot of years because I just couldn't do it. I was chasing a daughter, I was chasing a son. My wife was going bananas, you know, and all these things were happening, and I couldn't get up there and do that. So, but today I don't mind doing it because I like to give back something. This guy, he wasn't the same kind of a drunk as I was. You know, he was a drunk, but he owned a lounge of all things. He owned a lounge in Lynn, a bar, you know, and a big eating place, and I used to say to myself, I'll rip this guy off and be on my way, and I never done it. He was a good guy. But I teamed up with a guy named Joe Howard from Malden, and this guy really helped me, you know. And my life is good today, and I'm glad I could come over tonight, Dave, and do this. God bless you. You don't have to go to Maine to listen to that one to get it all. Yeah, and thanks a lot, Dave.
Okay. Thank you, John, for speaking.
Yeah.
It's good to have you. It's December 29th, and it's 1993, and it was good to have John here. And it's snowing outside, and he came out in the snow.